So I was almost doing the Sabbath anyhow. And I thought, well, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take part of my day. I will rest Saturday night, take that off, and then go till Sunday at 6 o'clock at night, and then bam, hit the ground running, and I'm in going that way. And sure enough, I do that, and I stop getting the anxiety attacks. Because God is the God of the universe. He created everything, and He created time. And we all have the same amount of time. The politicians, the President of the United States, the CEOs, everybody has the same amount of time. So how do we manage that? How does God tell us to manage that? He doesn't really tell us much of anything else. When you're working, work hard as if you're working for the Lord. But then He says there's this one time I want you to just rest. And when the Lord created the earth, all that originates from creation. The first days, He did His work, 6 days, and then the seventh day, He rested. Now, that doesn't make sense. There's this omnipotent, omniscient God, and why does He need a rest? What's He need a break for? Well, if you look a little bit in there, it talks about how the Lord doesn't need the rest. I think He stepped back and He just looks at this and just takes a moment back and says, this is good. And that's what He says, this is good. And so we need to step back, take a break and say, God, what we have is good. There are some things we need to appreciate. And how many of you guys have been on vacation and it took you 2, maybe 3 days to just... Then after the third day, I'm finally, now I'm finally relaxing. But you know what? There's plenty of people, they can't. They'll be on vacation for a week, and they're still. And nowadays, it's easy to take your work with you. Take that little laptop, take that, even you got your iPhone or your BlueBerry, and you're working. You're checking those emails, and I know myself, if I let my emails go, I'll have 200 by the time I get back off of vacation, especially if I take a 2-week vacation. And so I like to catch up and do all this, but we're never dropping things. And probably 80% of those emails, maybe 90% of them, don't have any relevance anyhow. They're not important. But we just they make us feel important. So we need to take that Sabbath. And so there's some scripture verses that talk about this. Now, remember that when Moses got the 10 Commandments, and we'll just say it was like Charlton, and there's the waves of the laser beams and the fire coming in and getting those things going. So now whether or not this was in chronological order, anytime you read the Bible, you cannot assume that it's in chronological order. They're just recording things. But what you can assume is that if God inspired that person, whoever was writing it, to place it in that portion of the text, there's a reason for it. So if it was first, that means it's important. If God put the first commandment and He's never changed it, and Jesus confirms it and says, when the guy comes up and says, Lord, what should we do? What's the most important things we should do? And Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, and your strength. Boom, that's the summary of the first commandment. If you keep that one, all these other ones just fall into line. So that importance is there. So Moses, right before he goes down to the golden calf, in Exodus chapter 31, he puts this big summary about the Sabbath. He had all these other commandments he could talk about, murder and adultery, and boy, those bad ones, and carving graven images, because again, we're coming right into this graven image thing. They already created the idol. They already abandoned God. They created the image, and they were profaning God's name, I'm sure, at that time. That God, He doesn't exist. Why bother with this Moses? He's up the mountain. Who knows where he's at? And so he comes down. But what Moses chooses to put right before the golden calf incident, a summary of the Sabbath. Boy, we need to think about this Sabbath thing. It's a serious thing. So we go down the list here, and we already talked about death for violation of the Sabbath. That was pretty clear in the Old Testament. It was a sign between God and his people. So when we keep the Sabbath, we are reaffirming that we are God's people. We do this for the reason of glorifying him. We're not doing it just to rest. There's some multiple motivators here to do this. It's a sign. God rested and was refreshed on the seventh day. And again, we're talking about that refreshing thing. God doesn't need refreshed, but he takes joy. And when we get refreshed, it's not necessarily because we're tired, but if we were all sweaty or whatever, we may not be totally tired, but when we get into that shower or whatever, we come out refreshed, and it's just a refreshing thing. So God was refreshed by this Sabbath, when his people keep the Sabbath. And God, when he created the world, was refreshed when he rested. All right. So I gave you my story of that, and I couldn't directly correlate it and say, because I decided to keep the Sabbath, I stopped having anxiety attacks. Because it just sort of grays. But I know, I prayed, and I said, God, you are the God of time. So if you are the God of time, you will maximize my time and my efficiency in those other hours that I have if I keep your Sabbath holy. And after I did that, then I could finally go and say, you know what? It's God's problem. If he's going to help me get through this program, it's going to have to be on his schedule and his time, because I'm not going to be able to do it. I'm going to just follow his word, step out in faith, and sure enough, my anxiety attacks go away. Guess what? I didn't have to go to the psychologist or Wes for 6 months of counseling. And not that that's a bad thing if you're going and doing those things. That's not bad. But it was sure nice to not have to do that, because I just followed this Bible here. This is a pretty cool thing. Man, God, thank you. So I went and did that, and it says, here's some more scripture verses. Isaiah 56 is a great chapter on the Sabbath and all the blessings. And it's talking about the Sabbath was one of the key factors for salvation for the Gentiles. In case you guys haven't noticed, we're the Gentiles. We're grafted in. Israel was God's chosen people. We get grafted in. One of the ways that the Gentiles at that time, which were ostracized, they were not included in anything. So God says it right in the Old Testament in Isaiah, and he says, the way of the Gentiles to come into being a chosen people, one of the factors is, and one of them was obedience and righteousness and that kind of thing, but one of the other, and there's only 2 or 3 items that he spells out there, one of the key factors was keeping the Sabbath. It goes, blessed is the man who keeps from defiling the Sabbath. When keeping the Sabbath, foreigners and eunuchs are welcomed to a place better than sons and daughters. Now, eunuchs were considered sort of outcasts too. If you had damage in any way to your unit, all right, you were considered an outcast. You could not be a priest. You couldn't even be considered into the chosen people. You were just outcast. Same way with anybody that was sick or defiled. You were considered dirty, and it was because God punished you. See, that's why that happened to you, because you were punished. Remember when Jesus was asked, hey, why did this guy become blind? Was it because of his parents or something he did? And Jesus says, no. It was so that God would be glorified, but it had nothing to do with his parents or what he did. So these people that are in these circumstances, they might have done something to cause that, but a lot of instances, you don't get leprosy because you want to or because you did something bad. It just happened that way. So one of the ways into the kingdom was keeping the Sabbath for the eunuchs and the foreigners, which were rejected. Sons of foreigners, and everyone will be brought to the Lord's holy mountain when you keep the Sabbath. Man, when I looked at that, and you look at a lot of things that happen in the Old Testament, it happens on a mountain. It's just the way it is. People say, why do you go backpacking? Why do you do this kind of... Well, you know what? One of the things is, I don't have any direct correlation. But when I climb that mountain, and I'm up there on top of that mountain, it's just cool stuff. God speaks up on mountains. I don't know why he does it, but he just does it. So that's what the Sabbath does. It's our way, if we can't get there directly, it's our way of metaphorically getting to the mountain. So it's a cool thing. Now, Jesus went and clarified, because the Jews took it to the extreme, and they made all these rules. And if the Jewish book of the rules would be called the Talmud. So that's their interpretation of what the Scripture meant. So if you'll read in Scripture, and you'll see in the New Testament, it says it was a Sabbath day's journey. Now, a Sabbath day's journey meant you can only walk so far. I think it was a mile. That's all you could go. You couldn't go any more than a mile. If you stepped one more inside that mile, violation of the Sabbath. Now, I don't know in Jesus' time whether they went to the extreme of killing people if they violated the Sabbath, but I'll tell you, you could have got scourged or whatever, or ostracized for whatever the reason is. Jesus comes in, upsets that apple cart. Now, Jesus kept every single law perfectly. That's why he came. He came to show us the law is good, and he kept every single aspect of it. So when he said and did things on the Sabbath, he wasn't violating the Sabbath. He was answering to a higher purpose. My little analogy is, if the speed limit is the law, but the spirit of the law is safety. If everybody could go 1,000 miles an hour and nobody had any accidents, there's really no reason not to go 1,000 miles an hour. Really isn't. Or if I'm at a stop sign and I see a trailer truck lose its brakes and he's come barreling down, you think I'm going to stop at that stop sign? The spirit of the law is to be safe. I'm going through the stop sign because he's going to kill me and violate that safety thing. So the spirit of the law was being violated by the Pharisees. They were just making it ritualistic. They weren't doing it because they love God. They were just doing it to show themselves to be all holy, holier than thou. So there's four exceptions about the Sabbath, of doing something on the Sabbath. One was, obviously, Jesus did it repeatedly, and that was heal people. So if, Joe, if you can lay hands on someone and go heal them, do it on the Sabbath. You're not violating that Sabbath by doing that. The next one would be, get the sheep out of the pit. All right? So let's get into some hermeneutics. What would be getting the sheep out of the pit in our day and time? Joe, if you drive that motorcycle in a ditch, you want to get that thing out of there. You don't want to just leave it there overnight. You can violate the Sabbath and get that thing out of there, because that's not a violation of the Sabbath. For something practical.